What are the 11 types of serial killers? Wait, what? There's 11? There are actually many suggested types and methods of exploring the inner workings of serial killers, including astrological studies. But these 11 are the most commonly cited and most popular. First, we all know the basics. Serial killers are people who have 2+ victims with a day+ gap between the killings. They also seem to have these things in common, but not always. They have a tendency to be born out of wedlock. They were generally physically, sexually, or emotionally abused as a child. They may overindulge in alcohol or drugs, and this may exacerbate or fuel their fantasies. Also, there's the McDonald triad, which is to say arson, frequent bedwetting past a normal age for it, and animal cruelty. Now, there seems to be a link between these kind of childhood behaviors and homicidal and sexual predatory behavior as an adult, but that was really only set by the FBI, and later studies don't really seem to pan this out. Rather, later studies seem to suggest that these behaviors appear to be symptomatic of abuse, neglect, or brutality in general. Though a lot of defenders would say that this is exactly the childhood that these types of killers have. So it's not a causal model, but it is predictive to an extent. For instance, these children are more likely than others to become serial predators or to have other predatory problematic behaviors. Also, this gives professionals a chance to change these kids while they're actually still fixable. Another similarity between serial killers is head injuries. Some serial killers had head injuries as a children, but it's not quite as many as you'd expect from watching movies and stuff like that. Between a fifth and a fourth of them have head injuries as children. And while the aforementioned are common traits for serial killers, there definitely are some different styles to these crimes because different people do them for different but related motives. For instance, a bank robbery or a spousal homicide is a lot easier to solve than a serial murder because there's just so much less to go on, because the crimes are not a crime that happened in the heat of passion or in order to get financial gain, but rather are a crime that is planned or almost inevitable whether or not the perpetrator sees this as the beginning. I point this out here because there are two types we'll discuss at the end that don't technically plan the murder of their victims, but given their psychology and emotional desires from these situations, murder is highly likely. So given that we can pretty clearly see the differences in psychological makeup and actions of serial killers, how specifically can we differentiate these different types of serial murderers apart? Well, like most questions we tackle on this channel, it ultimately depends on who you ask. But for our purposes here, we can say that there are 11 types of serial killers, some of which overlap, but not fully. And these 11 types will be broken down into 3 sets based on their typical uses. So the first 3 are from the FBI, the next 4 are from scholars, and then the last 4 are from scholars using a different FBI schematic, and these are the ones that are most commonly cited. They could be used together or separately, but they actually have different aims. So the FBI or the FBI-based categories are interested in describing a killer that is unknown to the police so they can better apprehend them. The scholars are interested in strong categories to differentiate serial killers based on motive in hindsight. So both of them actually have their strengths and their weaknesses. And in my opinion, they kind of overlap, and some of the categories are rather general or kind of fuzzy. If you've seen almost any movie or TV show about an FBI profiler, you're familiar with the FBI's original model for serial killers: organized, disorganized, or mixed. And the difference between organized and disorganized is really basic. Organized serial killers are methodical, plan out their crimes and escapes, and account for how they're going to leave the crime scene and the body. Disorganized serial killers, on the other hand, are often acting out of impulse and opportunity. They don't really think through their plans, or they don't even have a plan at all. And then there are some perpetrators that are kind of both, and they're referred to as mixed. The FBI have worked out several common facets of the 2 different types that actually flesh these out in a way that makes them pretty helpful. So organized serial killers generally have an above average intelligence. So they often plan things methodically. Usually they abduct their victims. They have a tendency to kill in one place and leave, dispose, or stage the body in another. They're often geographically mobile and move around. Very often they go to great lengths to make their crimes difficult to discover. For instance, setting up others to take the blame, faking evidence, burying the head in a separate place. Organized serial killers are also socially adequate. They might live with a partner or even date frequently. They usually don't have any issues connecting with other people, at least on a superficial level. They can be loners, but it's usually by choice, because they feel superior to other people. Some may be stable father figures, college educated, and have good hygiene and housekeeping skills. Most organized serial killers are diurnal. They're up during the day and they sleep at night. In other words, they have daytime habits. Many of them lure their victims with ploys. For instance, Ted Bundy used casts and injuries to make himself seem more vulnerable. Organized serial killers also follow their crimes in the media very carefully. They take pride in their actions like it's a grand project that they're doing. They return to the crime scene to see what they've done, and also to monitor police activity. They might even contact the media or the police. For instance, Dennis Rader, the B.T.K. killer, used newspaper ads and hid messages in cereal boxes. Organized serial killers are also concerned with presenting themselves in a very favorable light. They want to be seen as a good person, or a flashy person, a powerful person, somebody that has flashy cars and dress, somebody that's super likable and non-threatening. Organized serial killers can also enjoy power games with people at work or in public. For instance, the B.T.K. killer, at one point he had a woman's dog euthanized for absolutely no reason, and would cite people for stuff like their grass being too long. Organized serial killers often are police kind of groupies or wannabes, and organized serial killers are generally sexually competent. They're usually involved with a woman who doesn't actually know anything about their serial murder, but they have a tendency to have BDSM-style sex, including bondage with this specific female partner. Organized serial killers are more likely than disorganized to dismember the corpse after killing. They also have a tendency to personify their victims. They select them according to a very specific schema or type. Most people would describe them as a really nice guy, and most of them have a tendency to rape the victims before the homicide occurs. A couple of examples of organized serial killers are Ted Bundy, though it should be mentioned he became disorganized towards the end. There's B.T.K, Kenneth Bianchi, Ed Kemper, John Wayne Gacy, and Chris Wilder. And while you might think that disorganized serial killers would just be the opposite, they are and they aren't. So disorganized serial killers often have an IQ between about 80 and 90. They're often high school dropouts. They often don't really hunt or stalk their victims. Rather, they'll murder somebody if and when the opportunity arises, or just have completely random victims. Disorganized serial killers rarely bother to dispose of the body. They just leave it at the same place they found and killed the victim. Disorganized serial killers are more likely to carry out a blitz attack, like popping out of nowhere without warning and attacking people in the face. They rarely bother to cover their tracks at all. And though they're sloppy, they may avoid capture for a while because there's really just not enough evidence to pinpoint someone. Once they have suspects, there's a ton of evidence to look at that suspect with, but it's hard to start pinpointing suspects sometimes with these cases. Disorganized serial killers have few, if any, friends. They're socially inadequate. Most do not date, they live alone, and they often have poor hygiene and housekeeping skills. Many disorganized serial killers have a history of mental problems. They're regarded by acquaintances as eccentric or a bit creepy. Disorganized serial killers tend to have sex with the victim's corpse after death. They tend to be nocturnal, which is to say they're out at night when others are sleeping. They often have a clunky car or a pickup truck, if any vehicle at all. They might return to the scene of the crime to relive it, but not to check on the police. They'll often leave the corpse completely intact. Once they kill them, it's over. They're not concerned with staging, dismembering, or moving the body. Disorganized serial killers are more likely to contact the victim's family to taunt them afterwards. Disorganized serial killers also have very little insight into their killings and may even block out the memories. But they often keep a diary of what they've done. Oddly, disorganized serial killers are often fascinated with self-help programs, particularly AA. For some reason, the combination of religion and group dynamics really resonates with these people. They also have a very distinct way of killing. They have a tendency to attack the face and sometimes blindfold their victims. If they do blindfold their victims, this may show a need to depersonalize the victim, or maybe they're even trying to hide the victim's eyes because the victim reminds them of a person that they hate or fear. One of the real clear hallmarks of a disorganized serial killer, though, is that they'll leave fingerprints, footprints, and sometimes even the murder weapon at the scene or close nearby. The crime scene will be chaotic and a total sense of disarray. Ironically, the disorganized serial killers are more unpredictable, which may make them harder to catch or even to realize that they are serial killers and not just random murders. A couple of examples of disorganized serial killers are Arthur Shawcross, Richard Chase, and Danny Rolling. And then there are mixed offenders who are both organized and disorganized. And while it's possible that a disorganized killer could become organized, it's significantly more likely that an organized killer will deteriorate into a disorganized killer like Ted Bundy did. Also, some of the mixed killers could be argued to be in both or either model. For instance, Jeffrey Dahmer has a lot of traits of both organized and disorganized killers. But there can actually be several reasons why a specific unknown serial killer happens to look like a mixed serial killer. For instance, there could be two different offenders, one who's organized, one who's disorganized. The offender could come across unanticipated events they didn't plan for. The victim may resist more than they anticipated. or the offender may escalate to murder during the course of another offense. Many of the crime scenes that end up described as mixed seem to involve some planning, but there's usually poor work in hiding the body. So a crime scene in disarray, and a large amount of physical violence done against the victim.
It's awful funny, whatever Jeff was cooking, Jeff never bought no groceries. So what could he have been cooking that smelled like chitlins?
A sweet, bitter odor of death began to infest the building.
Mixed offenders may also be young or involved in drugs and alcohol, and just kind of not all there in order to be as organized as they could be. For instance, Richard Ramirez is a perfect example of this. He was addicted to cocaine while he was doing his crime spree. And this model, while relatively sensible, has some critiques. This model is very simplistic and doesn't really add a whole lot other than to help with generalizing a starting profile. If the person is organized, meaning they're able to plan a few stages forward and hide evidence, it's much more likely that they're a connected member of the community, maybe married, and have to hide things from their families or spouses. Disorganized killers are much more likely to be loners and the kind of person that takes a chance when they think they can, or when the desire overloads them. Most disorganized killers don't really have a methodical approach to life in general. And of course, there is the controversy around the category mixed. This person has traits of both and is thus harder to predict. So critics say that the two major categories are just generalizations, and mixed serves just as a catch-all for outliers, making all three categories, but particularly mixed, mostly meaningless. It's not a very descriptive model ultimately, but like the McDonald triad, some investigators just swear by it, though probably not nearly as many as TV and film would lead us to believe. The system is the basis of the kinds of profiles like white man, 30s, loner, never married, etc. that you see on hundreds of TV shows and movies. Well, then what are the other 8 types of serial killers? Well, let's talk about them in 2 different sections because they're a little bit different. It's really a difference in point. The above 3 and the last 3 are interested in methods and how the killers kill. The scholars are interested in why these killers kill. In other words, what is their motive? But if you've read John Douglas's books, then you already know that the FBI thinks about who the victims are, plus why is the motive for a crime. So once the FBI sort of understands who the victims are and how they were killed, they can often sort of reverse engineer the motive and place the killer in a model of organized, disorganized, or mixed so they can narrow down their suspects. In 1985, criminologists Ronald Holmes and James D. Berger defined these 4 categories and related subcategories based on what they perceive to be the most fundamental of the specific perpetrator's desire to kill. The first type of killers that they categorize are visionary killers. These people are psychotics. These killers are suffering from a type of psychosis, so they hear voices or see visions that tell them they need to kill people, and eventually they follow these commands. These are basically the only types of serial killers that could run an insanity defense, and the perpetrators who actually have these psychoses are rather rare. So while many people fake it, most people are not experiencing this. These killers are almost always of the disorganized type. The crime scenes are usually chaotic, with a ton of physical evidence left over, but the victims don't seem to have any discernible pattern. Like other disorganized killers, these people are usually loners, but they are often extremely socially inept and sometimes non-functional in society at all. One really good example of a visionary killer is the serial killer Cleo Green, who believed he was being chased and attacked by these floating demons, and he stabbed and killed an elderly woman and was caught while he was trying to kill another. And while not technically a serial killer, Jim Gordon, who's mostly a session drummer, or if you've listened to classic rock for more than about 30 minutes, you know who this guy is. He wrote the piano melody on the classic rock hit Layla, or if you believe the rumors, he ripped it off from Rita Coolidge, but that's kind of beyond the point here. Gordon had undiagnosed schizophrenia and murdered his mother with a hammer in 1983 after hearing voices for decades that told him to do things like kill his mother. And then there are a couple people I want to point out here that are considered visionary killers by some people, but most people do not consider them visionary killers. For instance, James Fairweather, he said that he heard voices that told him to kill, but most of the court psychologists didn't believe this, including one who said that Fairweather told him some of the, quote, most antisocial and violent thoughts that he had ever heard. Another commonly cited visionary killer is David Berkowitz, aka the Son of Sam. And though he's often thought about as being in this category, he actually wasn't. He changed his story many times originally, and then finally actually recanted this and admitted that the dog really wasn't the catalyst that he said he was. The second category of killers in this model are mission-oriented killers. Now these guys are sane and not psychotic. These killers believe it is their mission to kill off a certain type of people. They usually, but not always, think of these people as undesirable or bad people. For instance, prostitutes, LGBTQIA+ people, homeless, Racial minorities, unfaithful women, sluts, old people, and the sick are really common victims. These killers would most easily fit into the mixed framework above because they're generally highly organized and everyday seeming people, but they also have a tendency to kill and leave their victims where they meet them, not to dismember the bodies, etc., just like a disorganized killer would. These mission-oriented serial killers are often organized non-social or disorganized asocial types of people. Generally, they're quiet, keep to themselves, unassuming, nice people, and people are often shocked when they're caught. Ted Kaczynski, aka the Unabomber, is a perfect example of a mission-oriented killer. He killed people who were advancing technology in ways he thought were destructive to mankind, and he wanted some type of revenge. Another example of a mission-oriented killer is Joseph P. Franklin. He's a Klansman who's convicted of killing several black people and interracial couples. And finally, there's Robert Hansen. He murdered at least 17 prostitutes in Anchorage, Alaska. Though it should be stated that not only mission-oriented killers target these people are often targeted because of their roles in society, specifically prostitutes. You know, if you think about prostitutes, there are other reasons to choose prostitutes, like they're involved in the black market trade. They're already doing something illegal. It's generally not that hard to get them alone soon after meeting them. They also happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time rather often. These considerations make them easy targets for other types of killers as well. Not that that makes any of this better, but just something to keep in mind. The next category of killers that they discuss are hedonistic killers. Now, these are people who enjoy killing for killing's sake or the things that killings can do for them. These are the ones who are interested in anthropophagy, in other words, cannibalism, hematophagy, which is to say drinking of blood, dismemberment, necrophilia, and other sexually deviant activities are common with these people. They're often highly organized, intelligent killers and very clearly fit into the organized model above. And unlike the other categories in the system, there are actually 3 subdivisions of the hedonistic category. So let's talk about them in order here. Thrill killers just enjoy killing. Thrill killers kill because it is fun. Kill for killing's sake, you could say. A couple of examples of this are Dale Hausner and Samuel Dietman, also known as the serial shooters, who would drive by random pedestrians in Phoenix, Arizona. There's also Lauren Herzog and Wesley Shermatine. They're known as the speed freak killers. While they killed several women in other ways, they also just killed random people while out hunting. And a third example of thrill killers is the Zodiac killer. He wrote, "Killing people is so much fun. It's even better than killing wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal. To kill gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl." Now, the next subtype of hedonistic killer seems sort of similar at first, but it's actually a little bit different. This group of killers are known as lust killers, and they're interested in doing awful things to the corpse or killing people for their body or body parts like necrophilia, mutilation, drinking their blood, cannibalism, etc. A couple of notable examples of lust killers. We have Elizabeth Bathory. She would soak an innocent's blood to stay young. There's Ed Kemper, who had sex with his mom's severed head. And there's also Gilles Doré, who was the general of Joan of Arc and who killed children, then made them in makeup and kept their heads around his castle. Now, the last type of hedonistic killers actually are pretty different. They're comfort killers. Now, comfort killers kill others for financial gain, like taking over their identities or stealing their stuff. For instance, H.H. Holmes killed many people, mostly women, and mostly for financial gain. He would take out life insurance for them, then kill them, collect the policy, and sometimes even sell their skeletons. Dorothea Puente, who's also known as the Death House Lady, killed old and mentally handicapped boarders and then cashed their social security checks. And of course, there are black widows like Belle Guinness, who killed her husbands and fed them to her pigs. Now, the final type of serial killers in this model are the power control killers. These guys are sane and they're not psychotic. They are somewhat similar to hedonistic killers, but these killers just deeply enjoy and crave exerting power and control over their victims, murdering them being the final act of control. They like controlling others and find it sexually arousing. Some violate their victims, some do not. These killers are fixated on the control and power over a helpless person. They are excited by the idea that they have the power to do whatever they want to the victim, aware of rules and regulations of society, but they just don't care. These killers often have a psychopathic or sociopathic type personality. Now, these are issues that are a character defect, not a break from reality like psychosis. A couple of good examples of power control killers are Ted Bundy, who's one of the most prolific and well-educated serial killers of all time, Dennis Rader, who was a church deacon, a family man, and was also a sadistic serial killer known as B.T.K, who had as much fun playing with the police and media as he did with his victims, including doing things like hiding notes in cereal boxes and other such punny ruses that eventually got him caught. And another example of this power control killer is Robert Berdella, the Kansas City butcher. He would drug, then torture and violate his victims for hours or days before finally killing them. And like every theory, this one has some critics as well. The critics of this system say it's not very helpful for figuring out who a specific offender is during a police investigation, so it's really more for scholarly classification than practical police work. And while I inherently want to disagree with this claim, I'm not a police officer or an FBI agent, so I'll ultimately just have to take their word for it. There have been other systems of classification laid out, and while they're technically newer, the most popular one was created by criminologist Dr. Robert Keppel, but it's actually based on Roy Hazelwood and Ann Burgess's 1980s classification of rapists. So again, this system is basically only applicable to signature sexual murder. However, it's worth exploring nonetheless, as serial killers are highly likely to be sexually violent predators, even if they don't actually rape their victims. For instance, B.T.K just killed his victims, but he still got off.
And at that time, masturbated.
So the first of Dr. Keppel's categories is the power-assertive killer. They want to show their raw masculinity and dominance over their victims, almost like attacking their victims as a chance to show their masculinity. These guys are usually in their 20s. They go into the event planning to rape, but not to kill. Killing happens as a result of the increasing aggression for the purpose of controlling the victim. This kind of perpetrator is going to eventually just feel like they have to kill somebody as part of this act. The central motive is really to assert masculine power over another, and the victim can be of either sex, but the perpetrator is almost always male. A weapon is usually brought to the crime scene, generally a knife or a rope, that is going to be an important part of the masculine identity that the perpetrator has formed for themselves before the act. Power-assertive killers are obsessed with projecting a masculine image in a very primitive kind of way, because internally they're highly insecure about their masculinity. These guys are often bodybuilders, have tattoos, drive really fast, have well-maintained sports cars, carry weapons, are involved in martial arts, and maintain a confident body posture and form. They may also be aggressive, arrogant, and condescending to others. Generally, they have a high school education, and they're often a high school dropout with a very limited sense of masculinity. Their taste in pornography is often very unimaginative. They have a tendency to like traditional soft erotica like Playboy or Penthouse. They may have a history of failed relationships and marriages. Their exes would likely describe them as a control freak. If they were in the military, it was not for very long. They'll have a poor record, and they were frequently terminated because of lack of team skills. If they happen to have a criminal record, it'll likely show power demonstrative crimes like robbery, theft, and burglary. The offender's need for power and recognition almost require that they be credited for the crime or suspected of it. So while they want to seem innocent, they may even hint or tell this to others just to get a rise out of people. They are not team players, so they're mostly a loner or almost a loner. Their victims are usually strangers taken by surprise at random. They often find them in the streets or in their home or workplace. In other words, these killers are just as likely to abduct someone or to find them in their house or place of work. But if they abduct somebody, their body is usually found in a different place than where they were abducted or killed. However, if the victim is killed in their own home, these perpetrators have a tendency to leave the body without posing it or mutilating it further. These types of serial killers have a long learning curve during which they grow and evolve their methods based on previous experiences. They generally believe that other people see them in a positive light and wouldn't suspect them, wouldn't think that they could do anything so extreme. These killers feel that their self-image is beyond suspicion for this type of crime. This allows them to detach emotionally from the crime, which gives them the emotional wherewithal to quickly repeat it afterwards. Likely because they're so focused on their image, these perpetrators stay just short of perverse or defiant levels of violence. So mutilated victims are very rare. The victim's clothes, however, are often ripped off, and the victim may be hit while they're alive, but they are rarely attacked after death. Traces of ejaculate are found at the scene, and the perpetrator may rape the victim several times before killing them. After killing them, however, the offender usually carefully cleans the scene of forensic evidence and leaves for the most part an organized crime scene. The next category to discuss are the power-reassurance killers. They essentially want to rape a victim into loving them. There is the gentlemanly rapist. The power-reassurance offender is usually in their mid-20s, but they're very immature for their age. The rape is planned, but the murder is not. The murder occurs when the victim's behavior contradicts or interrupts their fantasy. The offender then becomes enraged or coldly kills the victim. Then they reintroduce the fantasy back into the encounter with the dead victim. Post-mortem mutilation and necrophilia sometimes result as the offender insists on realizing their fantasy. In other words, the murder occurs when the rape fails to play out like their fantasy, and the necrophilia allows them to finish off their fantasy whether or not the victim participates. The main motivation for a power-reassurance killer is the realization of a seduction and conquest fantasy. The offender seeks reassurance that he is pleasing them or better than their other lovers. During the rape, the offender may be described as polite and gentlemanly, asking if the victim is comfortable and enjoying him or herself himself. This is part of why they're referred to as the gentlemanly rapist. This offender needs reassurance of his sexual competency, and if he doesn't get it, he'll become violent, maybe even killing the victim. Power-Reassurance killers are often lost in their delusional fantasies. They have a fantasy life so intense and contradictory to reality that they may appear emotionally disturbed or unintelligent to other people. Spending most of their time in this delusional fantasy world, this offender lives alone in isolation with almost no male or female friends, and most people would think about them as a weird loner if they even recognize them at all. Fantasies in these guys appear at a very young age and are strengthened by other environmental factors and difficulties in childhood. However, they will custom fit the fantasy to fit their victim if they need to. This type of perpetrator uses threats and intimidation to gain control over their victim. The Power-Reassurance offender has a really low self-esteem in general, so they're likely to complete their education, but they're likely seen as an underachiever. If they have a military career, they were obedient but undistinguished. However, they're incapable of the social interaction required to generally develop a sexual or romantic relationship, so they're highly unlikely to be married. If they happen to have a criminal record, it'll likely show solitary sexual acts like window peeping, fondling of clothing, pyromania, or kleptomania may be in their record. And if so, they likely have an extensive police record of these kinds of charges before they escalated to these newer crimes. Just like his family, this type of perpetrator likely lives on subsistence wages or is employed in a menial, minimum wage kind of job. Familiarity is crucial to his confidence, and he doesn't like going outside of his safety zone. He often works, lives, and commits crimes in the same neighborhood for this reason. His most common means of transportation are walking, and if he has a car, it's run down and poorly maintained. Again, this perpetrator is incapable of the social interaction required to develop a romantic or sexual relationship, and likewise with friendships. They deeply fear rejection and prefer to focus their sexual energy through fantasy and solitary sexual acts. This perpetrator selects their victims very carefully. They have a tendency to stalk their victims for a while. Sometimes their victims are a neighbor or an acquaintance. The victim is usually 10 to 15 years younger than the offender, but if the victim is roughly the same age as the perpetrator, they're highly likely to be mentally or physically handicapped. Living out their fantasy and the victim's vulnerability are the central things to this type of offender. They are not really that focused on a type of individual victim. This perpetrator actually has a long weapons learning curve. They often don't even bring a weapon to the first crime. And they bring something like a gun that won't actually fire right to the second one, and a knife to the third one, which they might actually use to kill their victim. This type of perpetrator deeply fears rejection. This kind of person views life as an observer, not as a participant, and they lack self-confidence in almost every aspect of their life. After they commit a murder, they generally leave a disorganized crime scene. They may take souvenirs and collect newspaper clippings in an attempt to keep the fantasy relationship with the victim alive. After the victim is killed, the offender may attempt to prolong the fantasy through necrophilia, mutilation, and ritual acts. Ejaculate is usually not found at the scene because the rape was unsuccessful and their fantasy was interrupted and they weren't able to finish. But because the killer will be able to play out his fantasies with the corpse, he will be reinforced to repeat these crimes, getting more and more lethal each time. The next type of serial killer in this model is the Anger-Retaliatory killer. Now, this killer is using a victim as a token of another person that they want to get revenge on. The Anger-Retaliatory killer is usually in their mid to late 20s. They actually plan the murder and the rape. The primary motive for an anger-retaliatory killer is to avenge, get even with, or retaliate against someone who's wronged them in the past, and more often than not, using a substitute for that person. These murders often involve overkill, which is to say excessive violence beyond what's necessary to kill them, and they use a tremendous amount of overkill for somebody not killing someone in the heat of the moment or out of passion, which in a certain sense makes perfectly good sense because they're trying to kill somebody that they think is somebody that they're mad at in their real life. Their rage is almost always inspired by somebody with power over them presently or in the past, like their mother, their wife, their teacher, a work supervisor, etc. This rage is inspired when someone, in his perception, criticizes, scolds, humiliates, rejects, belittles, or somehow disrespects him. But the focus of the attack will likely be an unsuspecting victim that kind of just looks like the object of their ire. Maybe the same age or maybe a little bit older, but generally similar looking. This type of perpetrator unleashes a blitz attack, striking the victim in the face and mouth repeatedly. The anger-retaliatory offender may use some ruse to get into the victim's premises and then stage a confrontation with the victim, acting inappropriately to get a response from the victim, which of course will trigger them to be more and more angry, which will trigger them further and further down this path. In this type of murder, there might not be any ejaculate found at the scene because the primary focus of the killing is the assault. The offender's age, emotional maturity, and experience govern whether he will be able to get an erection during the attack at all. Once angered, however, the offender will generally walk to the crime scene to attack their pre-selected victim. They may drive, but they'll likely still walk the last 200 to 300 feet. As the attack escalates, he may use a found object to beat or stab the victim. The assault will continue until the killer's anger is fully satiated, often even well after the victim is long dead. The anger-retaliatory killer has highly eroticized his anger, linking it to his sexual inadequacy. He generally does not consume pornography, but may have some curiosity towards soft porn like Playboy. In his education, he's had many disciplinary problems and is frequently an underachiever or a dropout. If he was married, there's likely a history of spousal abuse and extramarital relations. This is the kind of person that feels dependent and resistant in relationships with women and often uses violence to solve these conflicts. In other words, they're a domestic violence perpetrator. He is also sexually frustrated and frequently impotent. If he had a military career at all, there will often be disciplinary issues and early termination of service. They don't generally have a criminal record, but if they do, it will be impulsive offenses like assault, reckless driving, and threatening people. Now, the anger-retaliatory killer in general is impulsive, quick-tempered, and egoistically self-centered. They may be perceived as having an explosive personality. In general, there's a history of conflicts with authority in their life. They're not necessarily a loner, but they generally maintain shallow social relations, sometimes only limited to drinking buddies, and rarely reveals anything about himself to them. He may play contact sports and be involved in things like that, but his friendships generally don't go much deeper than acquaintances. The anger-retaliatory killer chooses their victims in advance. The offender would often see her near his neighborhood or his work and would note their address and level of vulnerability, and then they'd wait and wait for the feeling to build up until they're ready to go. But as I mentioned previously, sometimes this offender may actually kill the specific person that offended them. In these cases, though, the victim is almost always younger than them or even a child. This killer leaves a very disorganized crime scene. When finished, he will most likely pose the body in a submissive pose, on its side away from the door, face down, or with something covering its eyes. They'll leave the murder weapon almost always right near the body. However, they do often take a souvenir or token from the victim, and they experience no sense of guilt because they transfer blame for the murder to the victim and easily slip into a pattern of serial offenses in order to alleviate their anger. And finally, we have the anger-excitation killers, and they account for a very, very small portion of serial killers. Now, with the anger-excitation killer, their age can be variable, but they're usually a mature individual who commits their first murder by about age 35. They plan both the rape and the murder of their victims. Their primary motive is to inflict pain and terror on the victims for sexual gratification. The crime these offenders commit is characterized by prolonged torture and mutilation of the victims, most often well before death. They're focused on the events that lead up to the murder, and the murder in their mind is kind of like, well, everything has to come to an end. They have highly specialized and elaborate fantasies focused on their need to express power and control over others. Their crimes are highly ritualized and often played out in a tightly scripted scenario that evolves and is perfected with each victim. They carefully separate their conventional life from their fantasy-driven one. They probably maintain a private space where he keeps his murder kit, his souvenirs, and other fetishistic tokens. This will be a dark chamber of horrors in their basement, attic, closet, garage, or a nearby abandoned structure. They will also often be a consumer of sadistic pornography. However, the anger-excitation killer frequently has a good marriage and is a doting father. For instance, look at B.T.K. Generally, they're gainfully employed in a position with very minimal supervision. They may be self-employed, however, in a semi-skilled trade such as carpentry or mechanics. If this killer has any military service, his record is usually good, and he may have been selected as a potential candidate for officer training. The anger-excitation killer generally appears to be law-abiding and conventional and most likely won't have any type of criminal record. However, they may interject themselves into the search for the victim or police investigation of the murder in order to stimulate themselves further. This type of killer is often physically attractive, bright, and seemingly social. The anger-excitation killer's victim is usually a stranger that fits into an ideal type for the perpetrator. So the student, a prostitute, a child, an elderly person, a slut, a nurse, whatever they're looking for. And for clarity's sake, this type isn't always physical. It's often something about the person. But many of these killers have a physical aspect to their type, so they may be specifically looking for a very specific looking person, like a short redheaded woman. Some of these killers also have a fetish attached to their type. Sometimes killers will choose their victims based off of a type of shoes, a color of clothes, a specific style. The anger-excitation killer often approaches, seduces, and charms their victims. They maintain this ruse until they can get them alone. Then once they're alone, the offender begins to alternate between being friendly and threatening them until the mask completely slips and they just become threatening. They may very calmly inform the victim at this point how they're going to attack them. And they say these kinds of things so they can savor and enjoy the fear in the victim. Once these killers start to sense that fear, they begin a highly ritualized session of torture and degradation based off a complex of fantasies that they have likely developed since early childhood. The offender may attempt to rape the victim and actually ejaculate at the moment of their death. This offender tends to commit offenses and then dump the body away from their residence or place of work. The anger-excitation killer has the smallest learning curve of the lot because they're already focused so much on organization. This type of offender maintains a murder kit. They have weapons, restraints, and other instruments of torture all ready to go. They bring this kit to the crime scene with them. They carefully pack it up and take it away afterwards for safekeeping. In general, this type of offender shows signs of becoming compulsively organized and may have had several years of college education and may even have graduated. After an anger-excitation killer commits a murder, there are frequently secondary sexual attacks, for instance, insertion of objects, mutilation, and harvesting of body parts. The body might be left in a bizarre state of undress, reflecting some fetishistic focus. Items of clothing may be taken, cut away, or found nearby and neatly folded. Often clothing, body parts, or other souvenirs are taken and used for repetitive sessions of compulsive masturbation by the offender. In a certain sense, it could be said that the offense continues in the offender's comfort zone, far from the body of their victim, and it does not cease until the offender is emotionally satiated and completes his masturbatory arc. This type of offender is highly alert to potentially leaving forensic evidence behind and frequently moves the body from the murder scene to another location in order to conceal forensic evidence. While these are not the only categories of serial killers, these are the most frequently cited ones. And now I'm intrigued. What was the most interesting thing that you learned in this video? Let us know in the comments below. And hey, check out this other true crime video by yours truly. YouTube thinks you'll like it, so why not start that Beneath the Floorboards binge right now?